Hello, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Ryan. This is my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond. Analyze This Mr. Bond is the latest chapter in my long-standing, in fact, decades-long fascination with the character of James Bond. Just to play a bit of my own personal history, I was introduced to Bond, as many in my generation were, through the Nintendo 64 GoldenEye game, but it also came out around the same time as Tomorrow Never Dies. So Brosnan was the Bond who put it on my radar. But before I could go to see any of the Brosnan films, my father sat me down and made me watch the Sean Connery movies on VHS, which he owned and loved. So You Only Live Twice was actually my introduction to Bond, properly speaking. And it's been going strong ever since. I've been participating in the online community as early as the rumors starting to leak out for The World Is Not Enough. So I've seen the online Bond community shift from these, forum-based enclaves to this bigger network that's spread out across Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. And we're at an interesting point here in the Bond franchise that is pretty peculiar. There have been peculiar moments before. I mean, the transition from Die Another Day to Casino Royale was really rocky if you were in the Bond fandom at that point in time, and I think a lot of people forget just how much turmoil there was at that particular moment. But now it's kind of like an uneasy quiet. We just had Global James Bond Day. We're coming up. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the American release of No Time to Die. And there's kind of like this big wave of anxiety in the Bond community that is very palpable because the Bond community is so divided. No Time to Die was not universally beloved. I think, whatever you might say I personally like No Time to Die just fine. It's not the best Bond movie. It's not the worst. And I don't really have conceptual problems with killing off Daniel Craig's James Bond for a variety of reasons that I won't go into here necessarily, but it puts the series in this weird limbo that I feel like has Bond fandom very anxious, regardless of how you felt about No Time to Die. And that's just because it's been quiet. And I think there are a few different ways to look at that quiet. First and foremost, I think a good hefty pause isn't bad if you're going to do a decision like killing off Daniel Craig's James Bond. For me, Daniel Craig's James Bond was an isolated character. Casino Royale had as much to do with the previous Bond films as Batman Begins had to do with Batman and Robin, which is to say very little at all. So it always felt to me like a distinct version of the character with his own distinct psychology and would have his own distinct ending if they gave it to him. I never felt that it would ever transition into just like more of the episodic stories that we got in prior Bond runs. That just wasn't how that era was built to operate. But I understand that when people see James Bond die in a movie, it feels to them that this is like the death of an icon, not a particular isolated, distinct character. And the symbolic value of that aside, if you're going to make that move, regardless of whether it's just a dramatic move for the isolated version of the character or whether it's a big symbolic statement, you kind of have to give that statement some room to breathe, especially if you're not going to apologize for it. And I don't think Eon Productions and the brain trust there, really, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, have any intention of apologizing for that decision. They knew what that decision was, and if you remember some of the advertising for No Time to Die, they said this film will change everything, right? And it did and it didn't. I mean, when we come back to No Time to Die, and there have been, 5, 6, 7 James Bond films after it, it probably won't feel like this big, huge, enormous, weighty statement. But right now it does, and giving it some room to reverberate is good, both because it respects the decision, which you may hate the decision, but if you're going to take a big swing, you gotta, let the big swing be the big swing. And it also gives what comes next a lot of anticipation, a lot of build-up, and a lot of freedom to be whatever it is without immediately folks responding to the baggage of No Time to Die. Like, if a new Bond film was, coming out this year, I think it's almost like it would almost be too soon. As much as many Bond fans who hated the ending just want No Time to Die to be firmly in the rearview mirror as much as possible, it would be too soon. But I think also there are a lot of business drivers that have led to the new Bond movie being very slow. I think the Amazon situation with MGM and the new people who are partnering with Eon Productions to help shepherd these films has resulted in a lot of different dynamics behind the scenes. Road to a Million, I've heard both off the record and then just on the face of it, it seems like a kind of very awkward compromise between Eon Productions and Amazon as Eon Productions figures out what they want this next chapter to be. And it's I mean, honestly, it's hard to figure out exactly what in, 2023 James Bond looks like and means. It was kind of, there was a lot going on in the zeitgeist of the 2000s where I don't know that Casino Royale was borrowing from anything at the time in the way that people felt, but you did see this sort of like strong influence of the other things going on at the time. It's coming out around the Jason Bourne films and Batman Begins and all these others, and it's picking up on that cultural fabric. Right now, what is the cultural fabric that can determine what James Bond is? I'm not sure, and I don't think Eon really knows either. And I suspect that's another reason they've taken their time to really regroup. Because there was a very telling quote that came out around when Die Another Day had, released, and they were in the build-up to Casino Royale, and I can't remember whether it was Barbara Broccoli or Michael G. Wilson who actually said the quote, but they were together, and they were talking about how they were kind of burnt out after Die Another Day. Like, they were losing their enthusiasm for the series and had felt like they were going through the motions and needed a creative jolt. And I think for both of them in their own ways, the Daniel Craig era was their way of making the franchise theirs, right? So GoldenEye was the original, transition film between, good old Albert Broccoli, who had, produced the Bond films for so long, and this next generation of producers. And so you see that transition point. In the Brosnan era, Brosnan was effectively Albert R. Broccoli's James Bond choice, right? We know that Brosnan was considered for A View to a Kill, which was a very, recent bit of news, or was, I believe it was A View to a Kill, very recent in the recent story, and definitely was practically ready to start shooting on Living Daylights, and you see that sense that choice was really Albert R. Broccoli's choice. The vision that we have for the Brosnan Bond films very much feels like an extension of what Albert R. Broccoli had built. Casino Royale, for both Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, was kind of a personal vision thing, I think, for them as producers. Michael G. Wilson had always wanted to tell James Bond's origin story. It was something he had pushed for in the 1980s that he didn't get to do. And Barbara Broccoli had obviously found something that she really liked in Daniel Craig in particular, in terms of what that could do for the character's energy. And Daniel Craig was a radical casting choice at the time. People forget just how loudly and how harshly people came after Craig when he was announced. And he won everybody over, much to his credit. But I think that era and the choice to both start it with a unique origin point and definitively end it is a way of them saying, like, this was, our Bond. And now Michael G. Wilson is getting to the age where he's going to move on from Bond pretty soon. And I feel like Barbara Broccoli, who knows exactly how Barbara Broccoli feels? I don't want to speak for her, but it's clear she's wanted to do other things, and it may be that she's felt like she's kind of completed a cycle here, and she's ready for somebody else to start, providing creative direction. And there's also just a sense in which the Daniel Craig era did derive a lot of creative energies from people who weren't the producers. The series before Daniel Craig was very much a producer-driven franchise. The producers shepherded the scripts. Directors were more of collaborators than visionaries. But in the Daniel Craig era, and you read the production histories of those movies, especially when you get to Skyfall and Spectre, it very much becomes a franchise where the director is determining the shape of the series at that point in time. It's a very, it's not producer driven, it's very much creative driven. It's like, who is the creative voice driving it? And I expect at this point in time, Eon is looking for a new creative voice. I think that's one reason why, regardless of whether the rumors are true, the idea of Christopher Nolan feels like it makes business sense for where Eon is at right now, because we know he has a strong idea for James Bond. He talks about it all the time. We know he wants to do it. Who knows whether Eon really wants to hand over that much control, but I think there's a certain level of like business logic from their perspective that would make that decision make sense. It's a kind of surefire hit. He's got ready-made ideas. It's easy to get, like, good to go. And I feel like that's kind of the holding pattern we're at. So here are my hopes for by the next time Global James Bond Day rolls around. With a pretty good level of confidence, I think we will have had a director announced, some sense of where that pre-production process is at. I realistically think, in my mind, I think it's likely that we start to see those wheels really start turning in after the holidays, in that time period. Maybe we'll get an announcement before then, maybe not. But I think it's likely we would see that in, kind of 2024 start to ramp up. And, potentially even get a James Bond casting announcement. Filming is likely probably a 2025 activity with a 2026 release of some kind. That would be the timeline that seems sensible to me. So by the next time we have a global James Bond Day, I would hope that we have some knowledge of what's on the way. I hope we have seen substantially more about the Project 007 video game. I think video games are the entertainment medium of the future. I think if you're not paying attention to how big they are for younger generations, you're kind of going to be lost in the sauce, lost a little bit at sea, a little bit with video games, because I think they're going to start driving culture in a major way. So I think a new Bond video game that is truly original has a lot of power to define the character in the same way that, the Arkham Asylum video games had a really big influence on a particular generation's idea of who Batman was. And I think you're going to see that in some ways, I think the Arkham Asylum video games are probably going to be more influential in terms of how people think about Batman and how that particular generation thinks about Batman than, the Ben Affleck or Robert Pattinson movies are, which is kind of wild to say. And I think we got to pay attention very closely to the Project 007 video game, because I think that is going to be, if it's good, will be very significant. And finally, I hope we finally get a 4K home release of the James Bond films, not just the streaming copies of the 4K transfers that we've seen on iTunes and Amazon. I really want that 4K box set, especially given that No Time to Die wrapped up the Daniel Craig series. I think it's a perfect time to have that entire set laid out. So hopefully by this time next year, we'll have that. I'm very curious to know what your thoughts are, how pessimistic or optimistic you are about any of those benchmarks being met. So feel free to weigh in on the comments as you're so inclined, and I'll be happy to respond and engage with you there. But this is just where this Bond fan's head is at. As far as my own personal wish list for what the series should do from here, I just want to be surprised. I think there was such excitement for me when I had come to love the Bond series during the Brosnan era, and then when we entered this period after Die Another Day where there was a weird period of limbo and we knew things were shuffling around and we weren't sure what was coming next, and Casino Royale came to the table with such bold and unique ideas, that was really thrilling. And I just really hope that what we get next doesn't feel like reheated leftovers of the Bond franchise we have to this point. I really think there's a good way to kind of like rechannel, fun Bond energy. I know a lot of Bond fans like just want Bond to be fun again, and I wholeheartedly embrace that. I want escapist entertainment that's lush and lavish and fun. But more than anything, I think I just want the series to feel bold and new and exciting once again, as though there's just a lot of opportunity yet to explore. And I think there are, and I think there are even things that have folks haven't paid attention to the James Bond comics as much, but I think, the original 2 arcs that launched the Dynamite run, Varger, however you pronounce it, Varger and Eidolon. I don't think I'm pronouncing either of those correct, but the Warren Ellis back-to-back comics, those set out a very interesting template for kind of like what a modern Bond could be, that I'd be very excited about if the movies are kind of going to pick that up. It kind of threads the needle between a Roger Moore Bond with a lot of swagger and a very deadly, lethal assassin with a hard edge. I think the hard edge is going to be hard to drop. I think people really have an appetite for that. As, like John Wick movies being successful as they are, it's like, I think people really want Bond to be deadly and lethal. I think the question is just what elements of fun you're baking into the series around that. I think there's a lot of freedom to do that, but I really want them to continue to explore that in the context of ideas that are really exciting, and I want this series to continue to take risks. I think it would feel, I don't know, the most exciting thing about the Daniel Craig era for me is that with every movie, you really weren't sure what you were going to get. It was kind of like, it was always, what is this going to be? It could go any number of directions. And then each of those movies from Casino Royale on, regardless of whether I liked them or not, they were just not a film I could have predicted or created in my mind before those movies released. And that, to me, is exciting, and I hope the series continues to do that. I want to walk into the theater and see something that I, wouldn't exactly have imagined for myself. And that's my hope for Bond going forward. I hope the next Bond film hits it, and I hope we hear news about the series soon. So thanks for listening to this rambling introduction. There'll be more videos to come. I'll, as the titles of this channel suggests, I'm very focused on Bond analysis. There's a lot of different aspects of the series I've written about over the years that I'd love to turn into video commentary and talk about with you all. But I'll just leave it here, and I'll catch you in the next one.